I want to transition the conversation a little bit and talk about like Jazz, the business. So Jazz is an MIT licensed project, or at least the main repo is. And we've had a lot of people on the podcast talking about what it means to build a, a business with a large open source component. We've talked to people in the open source space, or in the local first space, I should say, about the challenges of building like local first businesses. So I'm curious about your take on this. How do you think about how you license Jazz code, what needs to be open source, what doesn't, and like how you ultimately monetize this project in a successful way?
Yeah, so I'll start by just precisely describing the current situation. Well, yes, the framework and all of the packages around it are open source. There's an open source version of the sync and storage server you can run yourself. And again, just to be completely transparent here, it's easy to run that on a single server. If you want to scale it across multiple servers, we don't really help you with that much. But if you're smart, you can totally figure it out and you can basically build a clone of Jazz Cloud. And that's very intentionally. We're starting to build convenience features around that into the commercial hosted version of Jazz Cloud, which again is the sync and storage as a service, where you get a nice dashboard and you actually get these like weirdly precise but anonymized analytics about what users are doing in your app without any extra instrumentation. And that's probably where a lot of the commercial value in the product will come from. But because we're a startup and because this is a super weird new way of doing things, we're very aware that adding vendor lock into that would be fatal for people adopting it. The nice thing is it has all the local first properties, so the users already own the data. And by you having the option to run your own sync server or even have a hybrid setup where you have your own sync server as a backup that's connected to Jazz Cloud. And if we mysteriously disappeared, you could just reroute your clients to your instance of the sync server. You keep all of your data and you don't have to change a single thing about your app. That's a really important property for us and one that we will maintain for that reason. And in that sense, I think I'm actually really lucky because a lot of other open source frameworks with a commercial offering have a much harder time delineating what are like open source versus enterprise features. And for us, the incentives just seem much more clearly aligned. It's very easy to separate. It's a very easy sell to individual developers, to businesses, why they should use Jazz Cloud. It's mostly about the convenience of it versus running your own one. You really don't want to be running your own real-time infrastructure. Like that in itself is super hard. That's something that we can figure out at scale. And again, the special properties of Jazz come in really handy here because of the encryption we talked about earlier. You don't need to trust our infrastructure. So that's inherently already a different kind of relationship to it as a service. And the other thing is, because of the encryption, we don't necessarily need to run a typical multi-tenant setup where you get your own instance. We can actually just use really beefy servers for all of the Jazz apps because the data like doesn't ever touch each other because of the encryption. And that's just, again, makes this an even easier sell and even easier setup for us. What's actually challenging and something that we want to help our adopters find out is how do you sell local first apps? And I think part of it is exploring new ways of paying for apps. If people are up for it, really buying into that idea of users the data and you charge for access to updates of the app. But we also want to support more traditional models. And again, in the sense of being batteries included, the way that would look like is that we, as a developer who's using Jazz Cloud, give you really high fidelity analytics per user and dials to be like, if they cancel their Stripe subscription, you stop syncing specifically their account. And then for all intents and purposes, they don't cost you anything anymore. They don't get most of the value of your app anymore, but we're actually in this nice world where they still have all of their existing data that they had locally. And I think that can be something where we might end up in a situation where it's even easier for developers to integrate payments. And we really want to make that easy and help people adopt that because obviously our awesome local first app builders to be really successful with their apps. And at the same time, it empowers users more. I'm very optimistic about that part.
Yeah, when we talk to other founders, it seems like we will ask, okay, now what does the platform do? And they have to like reach and stretch for, oh, we can add some analytics here, you can see some graphs there, but with Jazz, you're reinventing the whole thing, and it makes sense that like you need a whole new tool set to think about it. I think how observability and analytics and these event things just are properties of Jazz, basically, that you don't have to worry about is super powerful. Like here at Descript, we have a set of 6 different tools that are a nightmare to integrate to get all of this stuff when it's just, oh, that's just like part of the data now.
Exactly.
A trend that we've definitely seen, and I think I hear more as I talk to people, is that it seems like teams are pushing to do more with less people, and they want less like overall expenditure, less tools, less complexity. I think it's a part of the sort of like crunch mode of the industry right now. But it does seem like tools like Jazz provide a really good opportunity is if you have less overhead and you can pull out more of these features. I think it'll be interesting to see where you go specifically around the sort of like product features of like, how do we help end user developers become successful? Because that's the big thing about these product like platform plays is what is the value we can add beyond just the sort of like basic stuff that's expected. But I'm also excited. This is one of the probably more mature things in the local first space. It's still like very much up and coming, and there's a lot of hard problems to solve. And maybe this is a good next question. So we talked about the schema problem earlier, about that's one of the big big hard problems in the space. What do you think the other challenges of the locals first space are? What do we have left to solve?
I think the biggest problem is honestly just getting people to think in that way, even like adopting a completely new way of building things. That's like always the hardest part. But I think in terms of what happened over the last 20 years, which is roughly like my awareness as a programmer, this is the most radical shift that I've seen. It's like in the front end sense, it's as big as Rails and React. But in the backend sense, like we haven't really moved from the traditional model at all. It's still database, client, server, and we've gotten more advanced about how we structure apps, how we orchestrate it, but it's been the same like all the time. And this is the first really different way of doing things. So the biggest challenge is just educating people, finding ways of framing that are either like familiar or at least not scary. And the nice thing about this is that's very much a collaborative effort because there is a bunch of local first tools. And in some sense, we're competing, and in some sense, we're like different approaches to the same thing. But the challenge we all share and where we can all work together is to even get people to consider maybe we should build apps in a different way. And that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about. And we're super early with docs and don't even have any blog posts yet. So far, the people who find us, like they already get it. They get local first, and they will work around all the rough edges because they really need it or they really see the nice properties of it. In my experience, introducing front-end developers to local first, like they get it as well, because for them it's the same cell as a backend as a service. It obviously works very differently under the hood, but in effect, it gives you the same thing plus all of these extra nice things. And they love the idea that they can now build whole apps without a backend. And this story becomes even more interesting, which is something that I actually hadn't anticipated when I started out with generative AI, because turns out generative AI is pretty good at chucking together front ends. If that's now all it needs to do to build whole functioning apps, you can suddenly move really quickly with way fewer people. And I'm excited about both what that means for individual developers or people who I would call almost developers, like designers who code a little bit, who can now confidently build whole apps. You can suddenly make industries out of what used to be tiny niches of end users that weren't worth building anything for, either in a commercial or just like effort sense. On the other hand, big companies who need lots of people can now suddenly be more modern again and move really quickly. That's what really excites me. And the upside of that is so huge, but it's still such a challenge to get people to even consider something new. So that's, I think, the main thing.
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels here between React and Jazz, where it's like when React came out, it shirked a lot of what front end was about, splitting HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, UI as a function of state. All of those things were super new. And I see Jazz doing very similar things where it's, okay, we had this backend. It's like a fractured Lego piece type of thing. What if we just reimagine that as one cohesive unit that can easily produce UI?
Yeah, totally. And I like the parallel you drew there, because the whole like, yeah, people used to be super strict about separating even behavior from UI. And now everyone agrees that obviously the way React does it is the way to go. And a lot of other frameworks start looking more and more like that. I think signals are now emerging as that's obviously the best way to do reactive state. And it's similar in a way, but I think it's even more drastic because it touches not just the front end, but the whole stack and reimagines it, like you said. I'm a very optimistic person in general, but I think give it 5 or 10 years and we'll look back and be like, how did we ever build apps like that? That's just so much work.